Oh, Jason X, you big, dumb, beautiful, dumb, messy, weird, dumb, so incredibly dumb thing, you. You know, I feel like a lot of people probably assume I'm massively familiar with all of the movies I cover on this show, but a lot of them I'm actually watching for the first time specifically for this slasher season. I'm familiar with a lot of the ones people consider classics, and certainly a good few of the titles on this list that had less savoury reputations were also not first time visits. But Jason X, this was a new experience for me, and wow. What an experience it was. Unfortunately, I was not able to go without prior knowledge into this terrible, glorious nonsense. Jason X is well known among slasher fans as that one that sent Jason to space, so the surprising shift in setting wasn't entirely unexpected, although the quality of the movie certainly was. It wasn't that I had heard good things about Jason X, quite the opposite in fact, but even with the echoes of 1,000 opinions ranging from "this is so stupid it's the greatest thing anyone has ever conceived" to "this is the worst thing ever witnessed by human eyes," I still could not prepare myself for quite what Jason X was, because it turns out it is both of those previous things, regularly so bad it's good, and in equal measure so bad it's real bad. I do not know if I would say I liked Jason X, but I can say I sort of respect it. It is certainly an experience. So before we even start with this one, how the fuck did we get here? Well, Sean Cunningham, the director of the original Friday the 13th, had been trying to get Freddy vs. Jason off the ground for several films now. But with New Line having the rights to Freddy and Paramount holding the rights to Jason, this proved to be a difficult task as the two studios constantly argued back and forth over who should get what when it came to a crossover film. However, after Jason Takes Manhattan performed poorly at the box office, Paramount were willing to sell the character rights to Jason over to New Line, although they didn't get the rights to the Friday the 13th name, which is why the next movie made in the series was the first to not feature that moniker. The plan was to start work on Freddy vs. Jason immediately. After all, how hard could it be when it's such a great marketing sell and the two characters are now under the same banner? Well, it turns out extremely hard. The project was put on hold for a while as they worked out the kinks, so Jason Goes to Hell was made to give them something for the rights they just bought, and then Freddy vs. Jason would be released pretty much right after. Only of course Freddy vs. Jason was absolutely not released right after, with constant back and forths, no one could settle on a script, no one could settle on a director, there was loads of arguments behind the scenes, the whole thing was just a big mess. And soon enough, several years had passed without any progress, and Sean Cunningham was worried that by the time Freddy vs. Jason did hit, no one would care anymore since Jason hadn't been on their screens for a very long time, and that the character might become irrelevant in the pop culture sphere. So obviously, the natural solution was to make another Jason film in the meantime, to remind everyone that the dude was still kicking around. The only problem was, what was the idea for that film? Space! Cried Todd Farmer, the writer of the movie, in a big dick move during a meeting with the studio. This guy just straight up went into the meeting with one single idea and pitched absolutely nothing else. He just went right up to the guys who he had to convince to commit millions of dollars into producing a movie on his concept, and all he had was, "Let's stick Jason on a spaceship." His justification being that was apparently the only logical direction left for the series. Was it, Todd? Was it? Was space the natural evolution of this franchise? When you watched that second film that introduced Jason as a killer with a burlap sack on his head running around cabins in the woods and murdering teens in the 80s, did you sit back with a wry smile and say to yourself, "Oh, I know exactly where this guy is going and it's past the moon"? Is that what you did, Todd? Is that what you did? Or was it the previous entry that did it for you? When you saw a body-swapping slug monster hockey mask zombie ghost trying to bring himself back to life and be met with negative criticism from fans and critics alike, did you think to yourself, "Man, they could have fixed this so easily if only they had a spaceship"? Did you do that, Todd? Is that what happened? Or were you inspired by the horror franchises that came before? Those whose characters had started on our earthly planes only to reach out and split the heavens, departing past the clouds and reaching the infinity of the final frontier, and seeing such wondrous success with their efforts. You know what I'm talking about, Todd. I'm talking about such masterpieces like Critters 4, Hellraiser Bloodline, and of course, Leprechaun 4, Leprechaun in Space. Was that it, Todd? Did you want to make the next Leprechaun in Space? Was the Leprechaun your divine muse, Todd? Whatever wondrous inspiration hit Todd that day shockingly seemed to resonate with the studio, as despite being the only pitch he gave, they went with the idea immediately. And with that, the character who once was just a drowned, neglected child was set to become a serial killer among the stars. Sometimes the planets just align and magic happens, I guess. And that is how we ended up with Jason X. Where do I even begin when it comes to describing this film? Well, firstly, let's talk plot. So starting in the present day of 2008, we see that Jason is all chained up in some military facility. It seems that at some point in time Jason was captured, but for reasons unexplainable, the government, despite their best efforts, was unable to kill him, no matter what method they tried. So, not knowing what to do with him, they simply kept him contained. Eventually, protagonist Rowan suggests freezing the dude, but a guy called Dr. Wimmer, who is inexplicably played by acclaimed film director David Cronenberg, wants to keep him around so as to study his regenerative abilities. The time it takes for them to faff around deciding what to do gives Jason a chance to break free and wreak havoc. After he kills a bunch of people, including Mr. Cronenberg, Rowan manages to lead Jason to a cryogenic chamber where she is wounded by him, as apparently Jason's machete that was unexplainably kept with him through his capture and not, put literally anywhere else, can also pierce through what looks like a foot of reinforced steel. Injury aside though, she manages to freeze Jason, and also herself, putting a temporary end to his current run of chaos. That is, until 400 years in the future. A school group of planetary travellers on a field trip are visiting a now wrecked Earth looking for artefacts of old civilizations, and stumble upon these two bodies, taking them both back onto their spaceship. Rowan to defrost and heal, and Jason just to study, and in the case of the professor who leads the class, possibly sell on the down low. Naturally, they make the mistake of assuming Jason's dead and cannot be revived, which of course in these films means he is definitely not dead and will absolutely be revived. And as the horniness of nearby teens on the ship tickle his spidey senses, Jason begins to stir, before fully vaulting up and wreaking havoc in his new setting, killing off everyone one by one and finally making the movie feel somewhat like a Friday the 13th film, albeit a Friday the 13th film with some of the dumbest set pieces, wonkiest early 2000s CGI, and goofiest tone, as newly revived Final Girl Rowan and a battalion of cheesy space-themed side characters, including a bunch of space marines reminiscent of aliens, a smiling android that talks like Siri, and of course a bunch of space teenagers, try and stop not just the monstrous Jason, but also his, and I say this with nothing but absolute delight, also his futuristic cyborg upgrade variant, Uber Jason, which is a concept that is both as dumb and as awesome as it sounds. Jesus Christ, man, this movie, Jason X, is like if Jason Goes to Hell was actually fun. It sucks almost just as badly, but at least it has the decency to do so in an occasionally entertaining manner. It's such a weird little artifact that you can't help but find a strange so bad it's good appeal in it. Even if that's just as this kind of look into all of the wonky decisions studios would make when it came to sci-fi around this time period. It's like when you see those retro looks into guesses of what the future would look like and they all have this kind of unified vision. You know where people in the 1950s imagined those in the 2020s would all be darting around in flying cars that look like something right out of the Jetsons? This is kind of like that. Obviously, I realise we haven't actually hit the 2400s yet, so who knows, maybe Jason X is an entirely accurate prediction of the future. But until that's proven the case, it's just so funny to see this extremely specific mid-90s to early 2000s best guess at what science fiction looks like. Look at this fashion, look at all this inexplicable PVC and leather, and these big Doom-like sci-fi guns and hilarious CG depicting the advancement of early 2000s buzzwords technology like nanomachines. This movie wasn't great at the time it was released, but it's also on top of that aged about as gracefully as milk. It is such a weird little zeitgeist of bad studio movies from this period. The film went into development in the late 90s and by God it shows. In true Friday the 13th fashion, it tries to rip off everything that was big and cool at the time. We get the Levine guns of The Matrix, the wonky CG that was the big new thing, the winking self-referential humour, albeit often done terribly, of Scream. That last influence specifically being included as a result of studio notes following the success of that movie that literally just said, this film needs to be more like Scream. It's such a Frankenstein's monster of what studios thought would sell at the time that together creates this end result that is almost a caricature of bad 90s and 2000s blockbusters. One that would sit perfectly alongside the likes of 1998's Lost in Space, 1995's Judge Dredd, 2000's Battlefield Earth, or 2002's Resident Evil. It's just so goofy. There's honestly no better word to describe it. And it's at its best when it rolls with this. Its biggest impediment is that it ever tries to be serious at all. I mean, it's cyborg Jason Voorhees on a spaceship. How serious can you ever really be with that? And yet it approaches a lot of its plot with this kind of straight-faced technobabble, and then has the audacity to throw in these weak attempts at comedy and winking at the audience as if to say, don't worry guys, we know what we've got here. But it's like, do you? Do you really? Because yeah, there's times when, say, Jason gets resurrected solely on the power of wanting to stop teens shagging, or a dude is impaled on a drill and then proceeds to sillily spin down it, or when Jason gets stuck in a virtual reality version of Crystal Lake and proceeds to kill two ridiculous caricatures of his usual camp counselor victims by literally using one of them in a sleeping bag to beat the other in a sleeping bag, that I think, yes, you absolutely know what you're doing. This is so daft and great and funny. But then the film unfortunately insists on padding between these scenes with extremely genuine but also extremely boring horror sci-fi that wouldn't look out of place on a straight-to-DVD production. With long, boring conversations that are shot with all the same intensity and lighting as an early episode of Law & Order. Or watching Jason Voorhees, a man who is most definitely not known for his subtlety, stealthily take out Marines like the film suddenly thinks it's Ridley Scott's Alien. Fuck that! I want dumb! This straight-laced stuff is dull as hell. It's hard to work out where the film stands. You can't tell what's intentional comedy that just isn't landing versus what's unintentional comedy that is. The lines blur so often. Like, yeah, okay, I'll give them the sleeping bag shtick is obviously self-aware and absolutely hilarious. But is this shot of Jason soaring through space supposed to be taken seriously? I'd say no, because obviously, look at it. It's objectively fucking hilarious. This big dumb hokey cyborg with a machete just floating menacingly towards the window is so batshit it can't not be funny. But then you look at this horrendously aged CGI crash where the ship smashes into a space station because their pilot has been killed, and it's played so sincerely, it's anyone's guess which bits you're supposed to laugh at. Either way though, intentional or not, when this film is dumb, it cracks me up so much. It's just a shame that the inherent dumbness that should surface simply from its core concept comes up so rarely. For every bit of brilliant nonsense, there's an equally dull sequence of sci-fi nothing. And even some of the dumb stuff has a habit of crossing the border of so bad it's good to so bad it's really, really bad. There's a random scene where the teacher character has a questionable liaison with one of his students, and we have to watch him scream mommy at her while she uses tongs to squeeze his nipples. That feels, and I mean this with no kink shaming intended, dramatically unnecessary. Add to that an extended sequence where the android character KM14 fights Jason after her creator gives her an upgrade, although she says upload in the film because apparently these terms mean nothing to early 2000s sci-fi writers, that makes her this wisecracking, kung fu fighting, gun toting, and inexplicably dominatrix-esque badass fighter who downs original Jason easily, blowing off his head before the nanomachines bring him back to life with his cybernetic upgrade. Which not only of course creates the immediate obvious plot hole questions of, if her creator could make her strong enough to kill Jason all along, then why wasn't this the first action taken before many people died? And also, so why can't they just use the nanomachines to bring others back who suffered far less traumatic injuries than an exploded head? But more importantly, it's just completely insufferable to watch. The scene goes on forever and ever and ever. It's agonizing. It just keeps going, and every second of it is filled with the kind of ham-fisted corniness that would make a preteen Disney Channel original movie blush. I hate to use this term because the internet has poisoned it, but honestly, this whole bit and the kind of smiling, winking shtick with which it is delivered is full-on cringe-inducing. That said though, let's not forget this is also a movie where a newly resurrected Jason, brought back by seemingly sensing nearby horniness, instantly freezes a woman's head in liquid nitrogen and then smashes her newly icy profile like a watermelon on a desk. And I don't care who you are, that's brilliant. Dumb as hell for sure, but brilliant. I mean, this moment alone had an entire segment on Mythbusters dedicated to it. So you know they must have been doing something interesting to get that kind of pop cultural attention. At the end of the day, the thing that I would argue makes Jason X a true Friday the 13th film is not its titular killer or its creative kills. It's that, much like every film in this franchise, it's a movie of give and take. It has some of the most fun the franchise will ever have. It's just a shame those highs are wrapped up in an otherwise extremely wonky early 2000s sci-fi horror movie with all of the trappings of the worst studio decisions of that period. It's dumb, but rarely dumb enough. Is it worth watching? Absolutely. If you're even remotely interested in Friday the 13th, it has to be viewed as this kind of insane curiosity. And even if you don't have any connection to the franchise, there's enough silliness here that it's still a fun pizza and pals movie. And the silly stuff is so out there, you're bound to have some comedic highlights, even if the serious to silly rate is an unfortunate maybe 70-30 split. It's a bad movie, but so are many Friday the 13th films, and more so than a lot of them, this is the good kind of bad. I certainly enjoyed it a lot more than Jason Goes to Hell, at least. It's not exactly a movie I can analyse much. I will say that there is some very, very light anti-capitalist critique with Jason only being kept alive in a problem due to financial interests, but this stuff is so background and inconsequential that I'm not convinced it isn't there wholly by accident. And even if intentional, it's honestly barely worth mentioning. It's not exactly a film rife with theme, but then when has Friday the 13th really ever been? I'm not sure it achieves its goal of making Jason relevant again in time for the next film, but I'm not sure it needed to because I don't think he was ever not relevant. In spite of his absence from screens for 8 whole years, I don't think Jason ever needed Jason X. But for a lot of fun reasons, I'm glad we got it anyway. And that is finally it for Jason's solo adventures before he was completely rebooted. That's every film in his original, somewhat confusing continuity in the bag. Wild to think we've covered 10 whole movies in this franchise now, but next is arguably the main event that this ridiculous number of titles was all leading to. A crossover duo between two of the most iconic names in horror ever to hit the big screen. So remember to subscribe to my OnlyDans and hit the bell below so you don't miss Freddy vs Jason. And if you've enjoyed this video, let me know with a like and comment. And if you're feeling really generous, you can support the channel by becoming a patron and get access to some cool exclusives at the link in the description below. As always, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you again tomorrow.